So good morning, everybody. Hopefully this setup's working a little bit better. I switched over to the laptop today. So today is Thursday, right? Thursday. I've got that right, everybody. Thursday, April 16th. Well, thanks for joining us today for another episode of our Chatting with NDGS Paleo show. We've been talking mostly on our chats about animals, I guess would be the best way to phrase it. Mostly vertebrates, animals with backbones, so fish and snakes and dinosaurs and mammals and animals like that. We did talk about some invertebrates a couple times, like with our state fossil teredo, and we talked about ammonites. Today we're going to move out a little bit broader and move into a different group on the evolutionary tree of life, and we're going to talk more about plants today and plant fossils. And plant fossils are important, even though they may not be as flashy as dinosaurs and things like that, because they tell us a lot about the environment at the time. So if we find, say, a dinosaur buried in rock and we excavate that dinosaur, we can look at that dinosaur and maybe learn a little bit about what it was doing and how it was living from what its bones look like or what its teeth look like, tell if it was eating plants or if it was eating meat. But to be able to tell, like, did this thing live in swampy areas? Did it live in warm areas? Did it live in cool areas? That we need other information from. And a lot of times we get that from the other animals that are with it, and also from the plants that are preserved with it. So it's really important when we're studying paleontology not to go out to a group of rocks and only look for one type of fossil. We want to pick up some of everything that's there because all of it gives us information about that past world. So today we have joining us Dr. Emily Bamforth. She is the curatorial assistant at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum. She got her PhD from McGill University, and she's been gracious enough to join us this morning. So I will turn it over to her, and thank you for joining us this morning, Emily.
All right, good morning, everyone. As Clint mentioned, I am coming to you today from a small town called East End, Saskatchewan. So just to give you a sense of where that is, if I were to get in my car and drive for about an hour directly south, I would be in Havre, Montana. So we're just north of eastern Montana here in Saskatchewan. And so a lot of the rocks that we get are the same ones they find in Montana, as well as in the Dakotas. So the place I work in Saskatchewan is called the T-Rex Discovery Center. And it's called that because about 30 years ago, they discovered a giant T-Rex really close to here. We call her Scotty. She's currently considered to be the world's largest T-Rex. But today, I don't want to talk about T-Rexes, at least not directly. I want to talk about something that's even cooler. And this is something that is very near to my own heart, and that is fossil plants. So fossil plants are super cool. And as Clint was saying, they're so important to paleontology. So I'm just going to show you a little image here. So as Clint was mentioning, when we find a dinosaur in the fossil record, it's great. So this is a T-Rex, and if we find a T-Rex in the fossil record, it tells us what that animal looked like. It may tell us a little bit about how that animal lived, about maybe the growth patterns. If we find other dinosaurs with it, it can tell us a little bit about the interactions between those dinosaurs, but it doesn't tell us a lot about the environment that those dinosaurs lived in. So when we have a fossil site, like you see the one on the left there, and we're digging up dinosaur bones, we don't really know if that animal lived in a cold, dry place like Saskatchewan, or if that animal may have come from a warm tropical place like Costa Rica. And so we don't really know a whole lot about the environment that animal lived in from just the bones. But as it turns out, fossil plants have the answers to all of those questions. So if these are an example of some of the fossil plants that have come out of the late Cretaceous from Canada. And they are fantastic because they tell us not only what plants were there, what the world would have looked like in terms of the flora, their plant assemblages, but also how warm it was, how wet it was, how dry it was in the summer, how wet it was in the wet season. It can even tell us about how long the growing season was every year. So plants are an absolute treasure trove of information when it comes to learning about the paleo environment, the dinosaurs and everything that lived with the dinosaurs was like. And so it's fossil plants that allow us to go from something like this to something like this. Now, I really like this particular image. This is from the latest Cretaceous of North America. So you can see right in the front, there's the big T-Rex. In the background there, there's a herd of Edmontosaurs, some of these big duck-billed dinosaurs. And then you can see it's kind of a swampy environment. We know that it was very wet at the time. But look at all of those beautiful trees. Just a really beautiful picture of what the swamp flora would have been like. So these big trees are related to a group of trees that are still around today called a swamp cypress. So just remember that name for a second, because I'm going to show you a fossil of a swamp cypress. So I really like this particular picture, but I find this one is even better because it's all plants. So this is what Saskatchewan would have looked like about 66 million years ago, right at the very end of the time of the dinosaurs. So you can see that there's some really big, tall trees there. And those are what we call the canopy-forming trees. Those would have made up kind of the bulk of the biomass of these sort of subtropical forests. But there's a whole lot more going on in there. So if you look at the ground cover, there's a lot of moss and a lot of ferns. You'll notice that there's no grass. So there was no grass in North America at the time of the dinosaurs. It hadn't appeared yet. So the ground cover would have been sort of mossy and lots of ferns, but there were also some small flowering plants as well. So that little yellow plant at the bottom there, something called an Oregon grape, which is still around today. And between those big trees and the ground cover, there are some smaller trees and bushes. That's called the understory. And a lot of these would have been flowering plants. So those pretty flowers you see is something like a rhododendron, which were around when dinosaurs were. So this particular reconstruction was made by one of our exhibits people at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum based on the fossils that we have here in Saskatchewan. So I want to show you some of those fossils. So I mentioned those big trees in the picture with the T-Rex in it that I called a swamp cypress. The fancy name for those are Parataxodium. And this is a leaf, or it's not a leaf, it's actually a conifer, an evergreen. It's a frond from one of those Parataxodium. So you can see that. That's a beautiful little leaf fossil. So even though the frond is pretty small, the trees would have been really big. They would have been up to 100 feet tall. And they thrived in kind of these wet, sort of swampy environments. So that was one of the big canopy-forming trees at the time. But there was another really important group of those big trees. And I'm going to show you two of my very, very favorite fossils in our entire collection. And they are these little things. Can you see those? Aren't they adorable? And you might think, well, golly, that looks just like a pine cone. Well, they are pine cones. At least they were pine cones. Now they're made of ironstone. But these are fossil pine cones that are beautifully, beautifully preserved. And even though they're really little, they come from a really giant tree. So also have a fossil of what the kind of the fronds of this tree would have looked like. You can see that there, right there. So this is a fossil from a tree that paleobotanists called a metasequoia, but what you might know today as a giant redwood. And giant redwoods are still around today. They grow in the west coast of the United States in California, and they're aptly named because they are huge. So here's a picture of a metasequoia, and I'll just show you. Can you see that guy right there? He's standing there climbing a tree. So keep that guy in view, and I'll show you how big. That's how big metasequoias are. So they are absolutely enormous trees. This particular tree, they think, is over 2,000 years old. Again, still around today. So these little pine cones would have come from a tree that was not quite that old. It would have been a little bit smaller. But the giant redwoods were the other really important kind of giant tree at the time of the dinosaurs. So there are a bunch of other really important plants that we get from the late Cretaceous, from the time of the dinosaurs. And those are those flowering plants. So if you remember in the picture, those really pink, those really beautiful kind of pink flowers that I said kind of related to rhododendrons, those plants are really important because these are our fossil leaves. So here's some examples of some of the fossil leaves we get from the Cretaceous period. You can see that guy. These are absolutely beautifully preserved. They look like they just fell off a tree yesterday, even though they're about 66 million years old. So this one is something like a birch tree. We don't know if it's actually related to a birch tree or if the leaf just looks similar. So that's one example. We get other leaves that are a little bit different in shape. You can see this one has got a rounded margin. It doesn't have any like jagged edges to the side of its teeth or to the side of the leaf. Here's another example of a leaf that we find from the fossil record. So the reason that leaves are really, really important to the study of paleontology is that is where most of the paleoclimate data comes from. So if you think about leaves today, so I don't know if where you are is like Saskatchewan, but we have no leaves on our trees right now. So you just have to think back and remember in the summer, if you go for a walk, how many different kind of leaves that you see. So let's just take a look at some of the examples of the leaves that we find in today's world. So there's a huge, huge variety. Some leaves have got jagged edges that are called teeth. Some leaves have got smooth edges where they have no teeth. Some leaves have one main vein. Some leaves have got multiple veins. Some leaves are compound, so that one stalk has got multiple leaves coming off it, and some leaves aren't. Some leaves are absolutely gigantic. So the one in the bottom right corner down there is something called an elephant ear. These grow in Costa Rica, and they are absolutely enormous leaves. And some leaves are very small. And some leaves even do weird things like have holes in them. So there's a huge variety of leaves out there. And the reason there's such a huge variety is that leaves are perfectly adapted to the climate that they live in. So, and I'll tell you why that is. So let's consider a leaf here. So this is a leaf from one of the houseplants that I have here. So leaves basically have got two jobs. They have to help the plant get energy, and they have to help the plant breathe. So plants, with a few exceptions, don't eat. They actually do a cool thing where they make their own food through a process called photosynthesis. So basically sunlight hits the leaf, and the leaf basically turns that sunlight into energy. So that's photosynthesis. So the bigger the leaf is, the more area there is for sunlight to hit, and the more energy a plant can produce. So you'd think it would be really beneficial to have huge leaves. But there's another little factor here. So plants, like you and me, have to breathe. So when we breathe, that's called respiration. When a plant breathes, it's called transpiration. So it's a little bit of a different process, but it's kind of the same idea. So when a plant breathes out, it breathes out oxygen, but it also breathes out water vapor. So it loses water. And that's a problem for plants because unlike you and me, they can't just go and get a drink of water if they're thirsty. So they have to be really careful that they're not losing water when they breathe. And so for that reason, if you have a huge leaf, the bigger the leaf, the more water you lose. And so plants have to balance the ability to do photosynthesis with reducing the amount of water they lose. And so all kinds of plants all over the world have developed different types of leaves to try and deal with that trade-off. And that is really highly correlated with climate. So for example, if you live in a tropical rainforest where it rains all the time, the plants don't have to be so worried about losing water, and so they can have bigger leaves. So plants have actually evolved, at least flowering plants have evolved, to maximize the amount of photosynthesis they can do through their leaves, but also to minimize the amount of water. And that is really, really highly correlated to climate. So what's great for a paleobotanist is you can compare what modern leaves look like with what fossil leaves look like. And you can compare the size and the shape of the leaf, basically what's called the leaf architecture. And by comparing modern leaves with fossil leaves, you can make really accurate estimates of what the climate was like. And so fossil leaves actually provide us with more climate information than any other thing in the fossil record. So that's one of the reasons that fossil plants are so important to the study of paleontology. So the other neat thing about fossil plants is how we collect them. So fossil plants are very delicate most of the time. So you have to be really careful when you handle them because they fall apart really easily. But as soon as they are exposed to the atmosphere, to erosion, they start falling apart. So for that reason, when we dig them up, we have to dig out huge blocks of rock and then split them open with a hammer and a chisel. And often the plants are sort of found on the inside of those rocks. So we collect plants with things like jackhammers and pickaxes because we got to get these big blocks out. So this is my crew and I actually collecting plants from a site, a late Cretaceous site, and we got about 250 different leaves out of this site, which is pretty exciting for us. So the last thing I want to share with you here, I want to introduce you to one of my office mates, and this is a tree. So this is Peter Jackson. Peter Jackson is what's called a Norfolk Island pine. So Norfolk Island pines today only grow naturally in one place, and that is an island off the coast of New Zealand. That's why it's called Peter Jackson. It's named after a famous person from New Zealand. And Norfolk Island pines are really popular houseplants today. So you see them in more places than just New Zealand now. But they actually belong to a really ancient group of trees. So Peter is obviously just a baby tree. He was a rescue, so I'm not sure how old he is. Probably about maybe 5 or 10. They're pretty slow growing trees. But these groups of trees, the family that this tree belongs to is called the Araucaridae. And these have been around as long as the dinosaurs. They're considered to be living fossils. And the most famous of the Araucaridae is a plant called a monkey puzzle tree. And I don't know why they're called monkey puzzle trees. They have nothing to do with monkeys. The only place they grow naturally in the world is on the border between Argentina and Chile, and there's no monkeys up there. But monkey puzzle trees were around at the time of the dinosaurs, and back then they were almost everywhere in the world. So it's just an example. So the Norfolk Island pine is an example of a tree that was around when the dinosaurs were, that is still around today. So a lot of what we know about fossil plants, we can deduce from looking at modern plants, which is kind of cool. And just to show you some examples of potentially a new species of plant that we found this summer, we pulled it out of a Triceratops quarry. It's pretty little there. So that's that little guy there. We have no idea what this is. It's not like anything we've seen before. So it could potentially be a new species. And a new species of plant, even though it doesn't make so much news, is just as exciting as a new species of dinosaur because it helps us to understand these ancient worlds that both plants and dinosaurs were such an integral part of. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening. I hope this has convinced you that fossil plants are super awesome and that we need more paleobotanists in the world. So with that, I think if we have any questions, I'd be happy to take those.
All right, back to gallery view. So monkey puzzle tree. So I do woodworking as a hobby. It has a two-part thing for the name as far as like why it's called a monkey puzzle tree. And part of it is just due to the shape of the outside of the tree and how strange it is. So they thought that even a monkey would be puzzled as to how to climb this tree. That was number one. And second of all, when you cut the wood, it's got all kinds of weird knots and things on the inside, so it kind of looks like little monkey faces. Or people think it looks like monkey faces. So yeah, kind of a cool thing.
That is cool. I didn't know that. I've learned something today.
All kinds of wood trivia. I don't know what the outside of the plant looks like, but I know what the wood looks like. Okay, so we have a good question, one that we run into quite a lot here. It's going to be kind of a two-part thing, and the first part I'll answer, and then I'll hand it over. It's how can leaf imprints be fossilized on scoria since it's a volcanic rock? And then how can scoria turn up in lamination layers with every fossil leaf imprint or horsetail or whatnot? And the first part to that is that locally in North Dakota and Montana, and probably, you'll have to tell me, up in Saskatchewan, the locals tend to call this red rock scoria. Scoria is a volcanic rock. What we have is not scoria. We call it that, but it's not. It's called clinker. And clinker is a baked earthen clay. So we get a lot of coal fires, underground coal fires that have they heat up all of the surrounding rock that has collected all these plant layers. And then it bakes that into this pink terracotta looking material. So how do those leaves get in there?
So that's an excellent question. And we have the same thing in Saskatchewan. We have this baked clay, this clinker, that has laminations of plants in them. And so oftentimes plants are preserved in clay. So that's actually what this rock is this is clay. And so there's a variety of different environments that plant leaves can be preserved in. One of the most common is something like a swamp or even a seasonal puddle where the leaf falls into the water and sinks to the bottom. And because there's not a whole lot of oxygen down there, it doesn't really break down the same way that it would if it just kind of fell onto the forest floor. And then they get sort of covered with layers of silt and mud. And so I don't know if you can tell on this rock has got laminations in it. This is a lake deposit. So these were leaves that would have fallen to the bottom of a lake and just been covered with silt. So the way that you get that red rock, that clinker, is that leaves are deposited in clay like this. And then there's a fire or some heat source, usually a burning coal seam underneath it that literally just bakes the clay the same way that a potter would bake like a clay pot. And that's actually really great for paleobotanists too, because it makes the rock harder, which means the plants preserve better. So that's a good question.
Were there any poisonous plants back in the age of dinosaurs?
There probably were. We know that some of the plants that we find have got relatives today that were poisonous. So we'll never know for sure. As far as we know, there isn't anything in a leaf fossil, like an impression, that would tell us that it was definitely poisonous or not. But again, based on what we know from modern plants and how we can relate them to fossil plants, we do think that some of them probably were poisonous. So for example, there is a nightshade kind of plant in the fossil record. So modern nightshade is toxic. And so we would assume that the nightshade in the fossil record was possibly toxic as well.
This would be a good one for you as well as Jeff. Where and when did grass come in?
So grass did appear in the fossil record. The earliest record is in the Cretaceous, but not in North America. Grass sort of took off as a very, very successful group in the Cenozoic, so sort of post-dinosaurs. So for the most part, the dinosaur ecosystems that we have here at least in kind of Western North America, probably didn't involve grass. That sort of came to be important in ecosystems sort of later on, post-dinosaurs.
Do you ever find bark or root fragments?
Yes. So we find a lot of bark. So bark kind of preserves the same way as the fossil leaves do. So we either get kind of the impression of bark, like sort of if a leaf or a tree kind of fell into mud, we would get the impression of the bark. We can also get coalified trees, so trees that have turned into coal, and often the bark is preserved on the outside of those as well. And root fossils is a really good one. There are things in the geologic record called paleosols, which are ancient soil horizons. And if you find one of those, you can actually see fossil roots that have been coalified, they've turned into coal, but you can actually see them still in the ground. Fossil roots also tend to turn into ironstone, so you sometimes find these weird kind of, they almost look like ironstone nodules, but they have kind of little divots on the side that tell us that they were actually plant roots at one time. So that's where a plant root has been. The root has dissolved and then it's been filled in with minerals. So you kind of get a cast of the plant root. That's a good question too.
It actually makes up one of my favorite rocks that people bring into the Heritage Center. They'll haul in this big boulder of silicrete. And so throughout the silicrete are just riddled with what used to be plant root holes, or where they were. And it's like, how in the world did they get in through this really, really hard rock? It's like, well, this rock used to be mud. So it's always a fun one to see. Were there any prickly plants or plants with thorns or thistles?
Yes, almost certainly. These Araucaria trees, I don't know if you can see the bark there, or sorry, the trunk, that's the word I'm looking for, has got spines on it. So these are actually pretty spiky. They become less spiky as the tree gets older. That'd be one example of a spiky plant. And again, just based on what we know from modern plants that have spikes have got relatives in the fossil record. We also sometimes find sort of spines and flowers of plants preserved that have also got what look like thorns and spikes on them. So we know that some dinosaurs would have eaten plants, and so the plants had to have some kind of defense to prevent them from being eaten so much, just like in the modern world, it'd be the same kind of thing.
Can't mention paleosols and not have me jump in. So if we go back to the last question, I'm going to share my screen real quick. All right, can everybody see that?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so this was a paper that I worked on with a colleague named John Webster up at Minot State in 2018. These are Eocene rocks. They're about 36 to 37 million years old, so around half as old as the dinosaurs. But these are those fossil paleosols, so fossilized soil horizons. And for example, here in A, I don't know if you can see my pointer very well, but these black lines are pointing out this is one big root running all the way down through here. And that root is just under a meter long. So that's a very deep root running into the subsurface. And then on the smaller scale here in D, you can see all these white lines running through here. So the brown is the rock. It's a mudstone. And then the white is root traces that are preserved with carbonate, kind of like limestone. And these are very fine root traces. So this scale bar here, that's a centimeter. So these are mostly less than a millimeter in size. So these are very, very fine roots, like you would get at the end of a plant's root system, those little hair-like roots that extend into the soil. So this was a very nice, well-preserved soil horizon paleosol that we described from here in North Dakota near Dickinson, what was interesting about this is these rocks don't have almost any fossils in them. Well, the only real fossils are these plant fossils and mostly just root traces. And what the root traces, along with some of the other evidence in the rock, told us was the reason we don't have other fossils there is because this specific soil was highly acidic. And so more than likely the bones, which are also made of a carbonate, when the bones were deposited in the rock initially after the animal died, the groundwater was too acidic and it ate all the bones away before they could be fossilized. So it wasn't that nothing was living in North Dakota at this time. It's just that the environment wasn't correct to preserve those fossils. And so this is where studying all the different types of fossils can help answer a lot of different questions that otherwise we would just stand there and go, I don't know what's going on. There's no, there's no vertebrates here. There's no invertebrates here. I can't tell what's going on with the animals. So that was a fun one.
All right. How many fossil plants or kinds of fossil plants have you found?
So here in Saskatchewan, we did a couple of studies, and so far we have 43 different types of plants. So it's not really easy sometimes to tell species of plants, so we call them morphotypes, which is just basically a way of saying a different type of plant. So we have at least 42 morphotypes of plants from the late Cretaceous of Saskatchewan, and then more from post-dinosaurs, more from the Cenozoic. So I find plant localities are often really exciting because you do often find many types of plants in one locality. It's not always the case. Sometimes you just find a locality where one tree has dropped a whole bunch of leaves and you just find the same kind of leaf. But many of them are sort of these kind of these lake swampy environments that have lots of different kind of leaves in them. So they're pretty exciting to dig up.
Can you give us some more examples of plants that were alive at the time of dinosaurs that we still have around today?
Sure. So I actually have a fossil I didn't get around to showing you. Okay, there. I don't know how well you can see that. It's not really in focus. This is a ginkgo. So ginkgos are kind of a bizarre group of plants. At one time, they were very common. They were very common in the late Cretaceous. Today, there's only one surviving species of ginkgo, and that's Ginkgo biloba. But ginkgos are an example of a plant that was around when the dinosaurs were, and were very common, and are much less common today, but they're still around today. Other examples of plants that are still around today, so in that picture I showed you of the late Cretaceous Saskatchewan, that Oregon grape with the yellow flowers, that's still around today. The fig trees, the ficus, was around when the dinosaurs were. There's some evidence that walnuts may have gone back, walnut trees would have gone back that far as well. Cycads would have been around at the time of the dinosaurs. So a lot of the plant groups that we find today were actually around when the dinosaurs were around. They just weren't in the same places that you'd find them today. Palm trees were the other ones. Palm trees were kind of everywhere as well. So there's examples of plants that are extinct that we no longer find, but there's lots of examples of plants that are still around today, or at least the groups that they belong to are still around today.
Yeah, lots of neat examples as far as what's still alive. We still have ferns today. We still have horsetails today. So many. The cinnamomum, which are a really cool little three-pronged leaf. That group is still around today, which is really neat.
Magnolias.
Magnolias
are one of my favorites. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And we have a plant that was named after a town in North Dakota that is extinct now, but it's pretty cool. I'll throw that out. Marmarthia was named after the town of Marmarth, North Dakota, way down in the southwestern corner. But that one is sadly extinct, but a really, really cool looking plant. I'll throw a picture up on here when we get the YouTube cut going.
We also have a plant that was very common in the Cretaceous called Spinifructus, which the name literally means spiny fruit. And they have seeds that are about this big. And sometimes you get them with, they would have kind of looked like a dragon fruit. That one is extinct, but was very common when dinosaurs were around.
It was always one of our favorite examples too with the palm trees is Jeff will go on a tour or something. It's like, what can this leaf tell you about our environment? And we just have how many metasequoia or sequoia fossils have you found?
Many. They are quite common in the late Cretaceous, again, because they are kind of these big canopy forming trees, and they actually survive the extinction. They go all the way into the Cenozoic. So lots. They're pretty fun to find, just knowing that the kind of tree that they come from. So one of the things I would love to do is to go and see those big giant redwoods in California. So I've actually never seen them. I've seen sequoias growing in New Zealand, but they're not native to there. That would be really neat to see.
Definitely on my bucket list too. They mock me because I'm our plant person. If it has to do with plants, they shove all the questions over to me. And I was very lucky that one of my friends is a landscape architect, and so she deals a lot with plants. And we had collected a whole bunch of plants from down in the Mud Buttes area and came back with just flats filled with these leaves. And some were just a margin or just a partial leaf or whatnot. And we tasked her with sorting through these drawers and drawers and drawers of leaves, and she loved it. It's like, okay, here's the single vein, and here's the double vein, and here's this one. So which made my job a lot easier, because then I could go back and at least get them into those morphotypes. Exactly.
Yep, they're pretty exciting. And the world needs more paleobotanists.
I agree. All right, we'll pass the mic over to Clint, and he'll give us our rundown.
Well, thank you, Emily. That was great. I hope everybody enjoyed it. Again, if you have any additional questions, we do have our Discord server where people can get on there and send us questions, or you can send them to us through Facebook and Twitter. And you can also reach Emily there as well. She's on Twitter. I just don't know. Do you want to plug your social media, Emily?
Yeah, so Twitter is just EL_Bamforth, my last name. And I'm pretty active on there. So please post, please ask questions. I check it regularly.
Tomorrow will be our last presentation of the week, since it is Friday. We are going to be talking with Amy Atwater from the Museum of the Rockies out in Bozeman, Montana, and she is going to tell us about a very interesting group of extinct dogs called the Borophagines, and maybe about dog evolution a little bit more in general, but specifically focusing on the Borophagines. We do get these extinct dogs here in North Dakota in the fossil record, so this will be very relevant to the work that we do here in North Dakota. If we were still allowed into our lab space, we could have specimens to show you, but unfortunately we don't have that, and so instead we'll have to rely on Amy's descriptions, and I'm sure she's got some great models and images to show us as well. So join us tomorrow for that, and then as Becky has mentioned earlier in the week, next week we are going to switch from daily presentations to doing twice per week, Tuesdays and Thursdays. It'll still be the same time, 10 a.m., but we're going to ramp down a little bit so we can take a bit of a breather on our side on these. So we hope everyone will still join us next week as well. If you show up on Monday and you don't see anything posted, don't panic. It's because the next presentation after Friday will be on Tuesday. So we'll keep reminding you of that until we get to that point. So until then, I hope everybody has a really great afternoon, and we'll hopefully see you all back here tomorrow. Thanks again, Emily.